1 minute, Ethan Cole's tightening bolts in a dusty Nevada lab. Next, he's staring at a dying alien star, accused of dooming a world he's never heard of by a crimson-skinned oracle named Syris. He's no hero, just a guy who fixes engines, but now billions of lives hang on his every move. The star's crumbling fast, cities burn, kids with tiny wings scream under rubble, and Syris's golden eyes beg him to run, even as she knows he's their last shot. Every flare tightens the noose. Save them and lose himself, or flee and watch a planet die. What would you do? Prophecy of the Starborn pulls you into Ethan's fight, where love blooms across species, his blood rewires a star, and one wrench-turning human proves sacrifice can echo through the cosmos. Step into a tale that'll grip your heart and light up the dark. Like and subscribe for more epic sci-fi adventures. Don't miss what's next. The sun hung low over the Nevada desert, a relentless orb of fire casting long shadows across the sprawling complex of the Horizon Research Facility. Ethan Cole wiped sweat from his brow, his calloused hands smudged with grease as he knelt beside the hulking frame of a prototype propulsion engine. The machine was a beast of steel and circuits, a marvel he'd spent months coaxing to life for humanity's next leap into the stars. At 32, Ethan was no stranger to long hours. His life had been a tapestry of late nights, coffee-stained blueprints, and the hum of machinery. His sandy hair was cropped short, his hazel eyes sharp with focus, though they often carried a quiet weariness beneath their gleam. Today felt different, though. The air buzzed with an odd electricity, a tension he couldn't place. His team had been testing a new fuel compound, something experimental, rumored to have been extracted from a meteor fragment. Ethan didn't ask questions. He built things, fixed things. That was his world. But as he tightened the final bolt on the engine's casing, a faint hum vibrated through the floor, growing louder until it rattled his teeth. He stood, frowning, just as a technician shouted from across the lab. "Cole, readings are spiking. Shut it." The warning drowned in a deafening roar. The engine flared with a blinding violet light, and before Ethan could react, the world dissolved around him. One moment, he was in the sterile glow of the lab. The next, he was weightless, tumbling through a void of shimmering streaks and distant echoes. His stomach lurched, his vision blurred, and then darkness. When consciousness clawed its way back, Ethan's first thought was the sky. It was wrong. He blinked against a dull throb in his temples, staring up through a transparent ceiling at a cosmos he didn't recognize. Stars glittered in unfamiliar patterns, their light fractured by a swirling nebula of deep indigo and gold. No Orion, no Big Dipper, just an alien expanse that made his chest tighten with awe and dread. He wasn't in Nevada anymore. "You awaken," came a voice, smooth as silk yet edged with something unearthly. It sent a shiver racing down his spine. Ethan jolted upright, instantly regretting it as vertigo swept through him. His head spun, but when his vision steadied, he froze. Standing at the foot of the platform, where he lay, was a being unlike anything he'd ever seen. She was tall, her presence commanding, her skin a rich crimson that shimmered like polished ruby under the soft light. Two delicate wings arched behind her, their deep purple hue fading to translucent edges that glittered with flecks of silver. They trembled faintly, like silk caught in a breeze, framing her lithe form. Her eyes were molten gold, piercing and unreadable, and a cascade of jet-black hair fell past her shoulders, streaked with threads of violet. She wore a flowing garment of iridescent fabric, clinging subtly to curves that seemed both alien and achingly beautiful. "What the hell?" Ethan rasped, pressing back against the wall behind him. His voice cracked, dry from whatever had knocked him out. "Ooh, what are you?" She tilted her head, a bird-like motion that made her wings shift slightly. "I am Syris, Oracle of the Veylara," she said, her tone melodic, each word flowing like liquid over stone. "And you are Ethan Cole, the human destined to shatter my world." His mind reeled. Alien abduction? Hallucination? The lab explosion? He grasped for logic, his engineer's brain scrambling to anchor him. "There's been a mistake," he said, forcing his voice steady. "I'm a mechanic, not a destroyer. I fix engines, not planets." Syris stepped closer, her wings casting faint shadows across the pearlescent floor. "The visions do not err," she replied, her golden eyes narrowing. "For cycles, I have seen you standing amid the death of our star, the end of Veylara." Ethan swung his legs off the platform, noticing his jumpsuit had been replaced with a simple gray tunic. He stood, legs shaky but defiant. "Where am I? How'd I get here? You can't just snatch people based on dreams." "You are aboard the Astral Warden, bound for Veylara," Syris said, her voice calm but unyielding. "As for your arrival, our extraction team employed quantum displacement. Your world will find no trace of you." The clinical precision of her words chilled him. Kidnapped by aliens who thought he was some cosmic harbinger of doom? He clenched his fists, anger overtaking fear. "This is insane. Illegal. You have to take me back." Syris's expression remained impassive, though a flicker of something, doubt, perhaps, crossed her gaze. "You will face the High Council," she said. "If there is truth beyond my vision, you may speak it there." Before he could argue, she raised a slender device, its surface pulsing with faint light. "Hold still," she ordered, stepping closer. Ethan tensed as she pressed it against his chest, her fingers brushing his collarbone through the thin fabric. Her touch was warm, almost searing, and he flinched, not from pain, but from the sudden rush of heat that spread across his skin. Her crimson fingers lingered a moment too long, tracing the line of his shoulder as the device hummed. Up close, he caught the faint scent of something floral and electric, her breath stirring the air between them. His pulse quickened, and he cursed himself for it. She was an alien, his captor, yet his body reacted like a traitor. Syris pulled back, her wings twitching as she studied the device's readings. "The mark is faint," she murmured, almost to herself. "But it is there." "What mark?" he demanded, rubbing his shoulder where her touch still burned. She didn't answer. The chamber's door slid open with a hiss, revealing two towering figures. Veylara, like her, but broader, their crimson skin dulled to a matte sheen, their wings absent. They wore armored plates that gleamed like obsidian, their faces stern beneath ridged brows. "Oracle," the first guard said, his voice a low rumble. "The human. Should we terminate him now?" "The prophecy." "No," Syris snapped, her wings flaring slightly, a subtle but commanding display. "He will be judged by the council. Until then, he lives." The guard's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening on a staff-like weapon. "Zoran will not be pleased. A human on the Warden is a risk we cannot afford." "Zoran does not command me," she countered, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "I'm the Oracle. My vision guides us, not his fears." Ethan watched the exchange, his mind racing. Whoever this Zoran was, he didn't sound like a fan of humans or of Syris's decisions. The guard stepped forward, flanking him, and he felt the weight of their presence like a vice. "Come," Syris said, turning toward the door. "You will see Veylara soon enough. Perhaps then you will grasp what is at stake." As they led him from the chamber, Ethan's gaze lingered on the ship's walls. They weren't metal. They pulsed faintly, like living tissue, veins of light threading through them in hypnotic patterns. He reached out instinctively, his fingers grazing the surface. It was warm, yielding slightly under his touch, and a low whisper seemed to echo in his ears, words he couldn't understand, a warning or a plea. He yanked his hand back, heart pounding. This wasn't just a ship, it was alive. The corridor stretched ahead, its curves organic and seamless, as if carved by nature rather than built. Ethan's boots echoed against the floor, a stark contrast to the silent steps of his escorts. His thoughts churned, back to the lab, to the explosion, to the life he'd left behind. He'd always dreamed of the stars, ever since he was a kid staring up at the night sky with his little sister, Mia. She'd point at constellations while he spun wild tales of alien worlds. Now, here he was, ripped from that life, alone in a universe that saw him as a threat. He glanced at Syris, walking ahead, her wings swaying with each step. Her beauty was undeniable, dangerous, otherworldly, but it was her certainty that unnerved him most. She believed he'd destroy her world. And if she was wrong, how the hell was he supposed to prove it? Back on Earth, the Horizon facility was chaos. Alarms blared, screens flickered with static, and Ethan's team stared at the smoldering wreckage of the engine. "Where is he?" someone shouted. Cole was right there. But the spot where Ethan had stood was empty, the air shimmering faintly before settling into silence. Mia would never know why her brother vanished. Not yet. On the Astral Warden, Ethan steeled himself as the corridor opened into a wider chamber. Beyond a vast transparent wall loomed a star, a massive, dying giant, its surface roiling with fiery chaos. He stopped dead, breath catching. Whatever came next, he knew one thing. His life, as he'd known it, was over. The chamber opened like a wound, its vastness swallowing Ethan Cole as he stepped forward, flanked by the Veylara guards. The transparent wall, before him, stretched floor to ceiling, a window to the cosmos that made his breath catch. Beyond it loomed the star of Veylara, a colossal sphere of molten orange, its surface alive with swirling firestorms. Dark cracks spiderwebbed across its face, pulsing with an eerie rhythm, as if the star were a heart on the verge of failing. Flares erupted chaotically, tendrils of plasma lashing out into the void, only to collapse back into the roiling mass. Ethan, a man who'd spent years dreaming of stars, felt a chill settle in his bones. This wasn't just a star, it was dying, and it was dying fast. "Move," one of the guards grunted, nudging him with the blunt end of his staff. Ethan stumbled forward, his gaze still locked on the star. The Astral Warden hummed faintly beneath his feet, its living walls casting a soft glow that danced across his gray tunic. He barely noticed the other Veylara in the room, figures in sleek, organic armor, their crimson skin gleaming as they worked at curved consoles. Every eye turned to him, some curious, others hostile. He was an intruder here, a human in a world that didn't want him. "Remarkable, isn't it?" a new voice said, lighter than the guards, tinged with genuine awe. Ethan turned to see a Veylara approaching, shorter than the others, his wings stunted but still shimmering with faint purple hues. His face was open, almost boyish, despite the faint scars crisscrossing his jaw. "I'm Kale, Stellar Engineer. You're the human, yes?" "Ethan Cole." Ethan nodded, wary but grateful for a tone that wasn't laced with venom. "That's me. And that," he gestured toward the star, "is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's a red giant, late stage, but the instability, it's wrong. Too fast." Kale's eyes widened, a spark of excitement breaking through his calm. "You know stars? Not many outsiders grasp what they're seeing. Veylara star is our lifeblood, but it's decaying, has been for cycles. We've tried everything to slow it." Ethan stepped closer to the viewport, his engineer's mind kicking into gear despite his situation. The flares are erratic, not cyclical. Looks like an energy imbalance in the core. Maybe a fusion disruption. He traced a finger in the air, imagining the star's internal structure. "If you got data, magnetic fields, plasma density, I could take a look." Kale laughed, a sound that cut through the chamber's tension. "You sound like one of us. Most would be begging to go home by now." His expression sobered as he glanced at the guards. "But you're not here by choice, are you?" Before Ethan could answer, a shadow fell across them. Syris, the Oracle, stood at the chamber's entrance, her crimson skin catching the starlight like a polished gem. Her purple wings were folded tightly against her back, their silver-flecked edges glinting faintly. She moved with a grace that seemed to defy gravity, each step deliberate, her golden eyes fixed on Ethan. He straightened instinctively, feeling the weight of her gaze like a physical force. "Kale," she said, her voice smooth but commanding, "the human is not your colleague. He is our prisoner." Kale bowed his head, though his lips quirked in a half-smile. "Apologies, Oracle. Just thought he might see something we've missed." Syris's eyes flicked to Ethan, Unreadable. What do you see, Ethan Cole? He hesitated, sensing a test. A star that's tearing itself apart, he said finally. It's not just dying, it's fighting to hold itself together. Something's pulling at its core, disrupting the balance. Her wings twitched, a subtle motion that sent a ripple of light across the floor. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze boring into him as if searching for a lie. Then she turned to Cale. Show him the readings. If he speaks truth, it may serve us. Ethan followed Cale to a console, its surface alive with holographic displays, graphs of energy spikes, maps of plasma currents, all in a script he couldn't read, but whose patterns felt oddly familiar. As Cale explained the data, Ethan's mind raced. The star's decay was accelerating, its magnetic fields collapsing in ways that defied known stellar models. He was no astrophysicist, but he'd rebuilt engines from scratch. He knew when something was broken. You said it's been like this for cycles, Ethan murmured, scrolling through a timeline of flare events. What changed? Something had to trigger this. Cale hesitated, glancing towards Syris, who stood apart, observing. That's complicated, he said. Our star isn't just a star. It's tied to us, our biology, our technology. When it weakens, so do we. Ethan frowned, about to press further, when Cale's voice dropped, his tone shifting to something quieter, more personal. I felt it once, you know. The star's pain. He touched a scar on his jaw, his eyes distant. Years ago, I was on a repair mission near the Corona. A flare hit our ship, nearly burned us to ash. I was the only one who walked away. Felt like the star was screaming in my head. Ethan studied him, seeing not just an engineer, but a survivor. Sounds like you and I both know what it's like to cheat death, he said. I've had my share of close calls in the lab. Makes you feel alive, doesn't it? Cale grinned, a flicker of camaraderie sparking between them. Maybe you're not so different, human. Their moment was shattered by a sudden jolt. The ship lurched, alarms blaring as the star on display convulsed. A massive flare erupted, a wave of fire surging toward the Astral Warden. Ethan stumbled, catching himself against the console, but the star's light seemed to pierce through him, not just his eyes, but his very core. A strange heat bloomed in his chest, pulsing in time with the flare, and he gasped as his skin began to glow, a faint, golden shimmer that traced his veins like liquid light. What the? He choked, staring at his hands. The glow wasn't painful, but it felt alive, like something inside him was waking up. Shields up, a Veylara shouted, and the viewport dimmed as protective filters engaged. But Ethan barely noticed. The star was calling to him, not with words, but with a pull he couldn't explain, a song that thrummed in his bones. Get back. Syris's voice cut through the chaos. She was beside him in an instant, her wings flaring wide as she grabbed his wrist. Her grip was firm, her crimson fingers searing against his skin, and her breath came fast, inches from his face. Up close, her golden eyes burned with something new, fear, or maybe wonder. Her lips parted, and for a heartbeat, the world narrowed to just the two of them, the heat of her touch igniting a spark he didn't want to acknowledge. His gaze flicked to the curve of her neck, where her pulse beat visibly beneath her shimmering skin, and he swallowed hard, caught in the intensity of her nearness. Don't move, she whispered, her voice trembling. It's not safe. The glow faded as quickly as it had come, leaving Ethan unsteady. Syris released him, stepping back, her wings folding tightly again. The chamber fell silent, every Veylara staring at him, some with awe, others with suspicion. What just happened? Ethan asked, flexing his hands. They looked normal now, but the memory of that heat lingered. Cale was already scanning him with a handheld device, his brow furrowed. Oracle, his cells, they're reacting to the star's radiation. There's something in him, Virion, maybe. Syris's wings tensed, her gaze locking onto Ethan. Impossible, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Virion is ours, not human. Virion, Ethan pressed, catching the shift in her tone. What is that? Before she could answer, a commanding figure strode into the chamber. A Veylara male, taller and broader than the others, his skin a deeper red, etched with intricate silver markings. His wings were absent, replaced by ridged spines along his forearms. He radiated authority, his presence silencing the room. "Oracle," he said, his voice cold, "why is the human still free?" "High Counselor Zoran," Syris replied, inclining her head slightly. "He may hold answers we need." Zoran's eyes narrowed, pinning Ethan like a specimen. "Answers? He is the harbinger of our end. Your vision named him." Ethan stepped forward, ignoring the guard's warning glares. "I don't know what's going on, but I'm not here to destroy anything. If your star's dying, let me help figure out why." Zoran's laugh was a bitter rasp. "Help? Humans are scavengers, meddling with forces they cannot comprehend. I've seen what your kind does." He turned to the gathered Veylara, his voice rising. "Centuries ago, a neighboring world fell to ruin because of human greed. Their probes, their mining, their reckless hunger for power. Their technology poisoned a star, and billions perished. I will not let Veylara suffer the same fate." The chamber murmured, some nodding in agreement. Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm not them," he said. "I'm just one guy, and I didn't ask to be here." Zoran's gaze didn't waver. "One human is enough to tip the balance. You will face the council, and if you are what the Oracle claims, you will not leave Veylara alive." Syris stepped between them, her wings spreading slightly, a subtle but defiant gesture. "The vision is not complete, Zoran. When the flare touched him, I saw possibilities." "Possibilities?" Zoran scoffed. "Your visions have never wavered before. Why now?" She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked to Ethan, a question lingering in their golden depths. For the first time, Ethan saw uncertainty in her, enough to plant a seed of hope. If she doubted her prophecy, maybe he had a chance to prove her wrong. As Zoran stormed out, Kale clapped Ethan on the shoulder, his grin returning. "You've got guts, human." Not many would talk back to Zoran like that. Ethan managed a weak smile, but his mind was elsewhere, on the glow, on Syris's touch, on the star that seemed to know him. Whatever Veylara was, it tied him to this place, to her. And as the astral warden drew closer to Veylara, he felt the weight of a truth he wasn't ready to face. His arrival wasn't an accident. The air aboard the astral warden felt heavier as Ethan Cole followed Syris through a winding corridor, its living walls pulsing with a faint, rhythmic glow. The star's instability gnawed at his mind, but so did her. Syris, the Oracle, with her crimson skin and piercing golden eyes. Since the flare incident, she'd watched him differently, her certainty shaken by the glow that had erupted from his body. He wasn't sure what Veylara was or why it tied him to Veylara's dying star, but one thing was clear. She believed he held answers, and that belief kept him alive. She stopped before a seamless panel, pressing her palm against it. The wall shivered, parting like a curtain of flesh to reveal a sight that stole Ethan's breath. Beyond the threshold lay a garden, an impossible, living world nestled within the ship. Trees rose like sculptures of light, their barks shimmering with bioluminescent veins that shifted from teal to violet with each subtle breath of the air. Leaves glowed softly, curling and uncurling as if alive, while vines draped from the canopy, dripping with flowers that pulsed like tiny stars. The scent hit him next, a heady mix of sap and something sweeter, like honey carried on a warm wind. It was a sanctuary, a slice of Veylara preserved amid the cold expanse of space. "What is this place?" Ethan asked, stepping inside. The ground beneath his boots was soft, mossy, and faintly warm, as if it lived too. Syris turned to him, her purple wings catching the light in a cascade of silver flecks. "The Heart Grove," she said, her voice softer than he'd ever heard it. "A remnant of our world, grown from the star's essence. It calms the mind, strengthens the spirit." She hesitated, then added, "I thought you should see it." He raised an eyebrow, surprised by the gesture. "Not exactly standard treatment for a prisoner, is it?" Her lips twitched, almost a smile, but not quite. "You are an anomaly, Ethan Cole. I need to understand you." They walked deeper into the grove, the sounds of the ship fading until only the rustle of leaves and the hum of life remained. Syris led him to a massive tree at the center, its trunk wide enough to house a room, its branches heavy with glowing fruit. She sat on a curved root, gesturing for him to join her. He did, the warmth of the wood seeping through his tunic as he settled beside her. Up close, her presence was magnetic. Her crimson skin gleamed like a jewel, and the faint heat radiating from her made the air between them feel charged. For a moment, they sat in silence, the grove's light painting shadows across her face. Then she spoke, her voice low, almost vulnerable. I was not always the oracle. Once I was just Syris, daughter of a healer, promised to a warrior of our clan. I had a life planned, a future. Ethan turned to her, intrigued. What happened? She traced a finger along the root, her wings drooping slightly. The visions came. They chose me, not the other way around. I saw our star's death, its fire consuming Veylara, our cities crumbling, our people lost. The elders said it was my duty to serve, to guide. So I refused the bonding. Her voice trembled, a crack in her composure. I gave up love, connection, everything to bear this weight alone. Ethan watched her, seeing not the oracle but the woman beneath, the one who'd traded her dreams for a prophecy she couldn't escape. That's a hell of a burden, he said quietly. I get it though. Back home, I've spent years chasing the stars, fixing ships that'd take us there. Never had time for much else. Family, friends, they all faded into the background. Just me and the work. Her golden eyes met his, searching. Do you regret it? Sometimes, he admitted, leaning back against the tree. My sister, Mia, she's the only one who stuck around. Used to tell her stories about alien worlds. Guess I never thought I'd end up on one. Syris's gaze softened, and for the first time, Ethan saw something like understanding in her. Perhaps our paths are not so different, she murmured, bound by forces we cannot control. The moment hung between them, fragile and unspoken, until she stood, gesturing toward a path lined with glowing stones. Kulme, there's something I want to try. They reached a clearing where the stones formed a circle, each one pulsing with a faint violet light. Syris knelt at the center, her wings spreading slightly as she beckoned him to join her. This is a ritual of resonance, she explained. It links our energies, lets me see deeper into your connection with the star. If Veylara truly flows in you, this will reveal it. Ethan hesitated, then knelt across from her, the stones humming beneath him. What do I do? Give me your hands, she said, extending hers. He took them, her crimson fingers warm and smooth against his calloused palms. She guided his hands to her waist, pressing them gently against the curve where her wings met her back. The contact sent a jolt through him. Her skin was soft ascendant. He felt the subtle tremor of her body beneath his touch, like a string plucked taut. Her wings quivered, their purple edges shimmering in the light, and he caught the faint hitch in her breath as his thumbs brushed the dip above her hips. His pulse quickened, heat pooling in his chest as her golden eyes locked onto his, dark and endless, pulling him in like a gravitational well. Focus, she whispered, though her voice wavered, betraying the tension singing between them. Feel the star. He closed his eyes, forcing his mind to the task. Slowly, the grove faded, replaced by a distant hum, the star's pulse, chaotic and raw. His hands tightened instinctively, fingers pressing in her warmth, and he felt it, a thread of energy linking him to that fiery chaos, alive and wild. When he opened his eyes, Syris was staring at him, her chest rising and falling faster. You feel it, she said, not a question. The star knows you. Before he could respond, their hands slipped apart, but the air between them crackled. She leaned closer, her face inches from his, her breath warm against his skin. You're more than I saw, she murmured, and then her lips found his, soft at first, tentative, then hungry, a collision of need and wonder. The grove erupted around them, light flaring like a supernova. Flowers burst open, petals raining down in a storm of color, swirling around them as the air thrummed with their shared pulse. His arms slid around her, pulling her against him, her wings folding around them like a cocoon of violet and silver. She pressed her forehead to his chest, her breath ragged, and the world dissolved into a symphony of light and touch. Petals falling, vines swaying, the grove itself alive with their union. Time stretched, infinite, until they stilled, her head resting against him, their heartbeats entwined in the quiet afterglow. The moment shattered with a distant explosion. Ethan pulled back, breathless, as alarms blared through the ship. Syris sprang to her feet, wings flaring, her face a mask of fear and resolve. He followed her to a console embedded in the grove's edge, where Kale's voice crackled through. "Ethan, Oracle, the Veylara amplifier. It overloaded." They raced to the lab, a cavernous space of glowing conduits and humming machines. Smoke curled from a shattered device, its core pulsing erratically. Kale waved them over, his face streaked with soot. "We pushed it too hard. Try to boost your signal." It nearly took the wall out. Ethan crouched beside the wreckage, assessing the damage. A cracked casing, fused circuits. Fixable, but dangerous. Before he could speak, Syris was there, throwing her arms around him, her wings trembling against his back. "You're alive," she gasped, her grip fierce, as if she'd seen him lost in that blast. "I'm fine," he said, holding her shoulders, steadying her. "Just a little singed." Kale coughed, grinning despite the chaos. "Guess you two were busy. Worked out the resonance, huh?" Syris pulled back, her cheeks darkening, a rare flush against her crimson skin. Ethan smirked, brushing ash from his tunic. "Something like that." As the alarms faded, Ethan turned to the amplifier's remains. The science was progressing. Veylara in his blood could stabilize the star. Kale had confirmed it. But the cost loomed, unspoken. To save Veylara, he might have to give everything. Syris's hand found his, her touch a quiet promise, and he knew, whatever came next, they'd face it together. The astral warden trembled as it entered Veyara's orbit, its living hull groaning under the strain of the star's relentless flares. Ethan Cole stood in the central observation deck, his hands pressed against the console, eyes fixed on the holographic display before him. The images streaming in from the planet below were a nightmare made real. Veylara, once a jewel of crystalline spires and glowing forests, now burned under the wrath of its dying star. A coastal city, its name unpronounceable to Ethan, lay in ruins. Towers of organic crystal, grown over centuries, shattered like glass under the onslaught of fiery plasma. Streets pulsed with bioluminescent vines, now choked with ash, and the air shimmered with heat and despair. Families fled, their crimson skins streaked with soot, wings flapping frantically as they carried children toward evacuation ships. Ethan's breath caught as the display zoomed in. A young Veylara girl, no older than his sister Mia had been when he'd left home, struggled beneath a collapsed beam. Her tiny wings, barely formed, fluttered weakly, their purple tips dulled by dust. A rescuer pulled her free just as another flare lit the sky, but the image seared into Ethan's mind. Billions lived down there, each life hanging by a thread, and somehow, impossibly, he was their only hope. "Another settlement lost," Kale muttered beside him, his usual grin replaced by a grim line. "The star's flares are hitting faster now. Days, maybe hours before total collapse." Ethan's fingers tightened on the console, the weight of it all threatening to crush him. Veylara, the strange energy in his blood, could stabilize the star, but the cost was clear: his life, his memories, everything that made him Ethan Cole. He'd known it since the lab, since Syris's touch had awakened something inside him, but seeing Veylara's agony made it real. Syris stood apart, her crimson silhouette framed against the viewport, wings folded tightly as she studied the chaos below. She hadn't spoken since they'd left the Heart Grove, but Ethan felt her presence like a tether, grounding him even as fear clawed at his resolve. He wanted to go to her, to hold her as he had under the glowing trees, but the distance between them felt vast, widened by the prophecy that still named him Destroyer. The chamber's doors hissed open, and High Counselor Zoran stormed in, his silver-marked skin glinting with cold authority. "Enough delays," he barked, his voice cutting through the murmurs of technicians. "The star falters, our people die, and still you protect this human." His gaze locked onto Syris, sharp as a blade. "Your duty is to Veylara, Oracle, not to him." Syris turned, her wings flaring slightly, a defiant spark in her golden eyes. "My duty is to the truth, Zoran. The vision has shifted. Ethan is no longer just a threat. He may be our salvation." Zoran's laugh was a bitter rasp. "Salvation? He carries Veylara, yes, but that makes him a weapon, not a savior. The Council demands action. Now." Ethan stepped forward, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. "I'm not delaying anything. We're refining the amplifier to make sure it works. Push it too soon, and you'll lose more than just me." Zoran's eyes narrowed, but before he could retort, Syris moved between them, her presence a quiet storm. "He speaks truth," she said. "The process is delicate. Force it, and we risk everything." The counselor's jaw tightened, his spines bristling. 3 days, Oracle. Then we proceed, with or without your consent." He turned to Ethan, his voice low with menace. "Prove your worth, human, or I'll end you myself." As Zoran departed, the chamber fell silent, the weight of his ultimatum hanging like smoke. Ethan glanced at Syris, expecting her to speak, but she slipped past him, her wings brushing the air as she vanished into a side corridor. He followed, driven by a need he couldn't name, his boots echoing in the narrow passage. He found her in a shadowed alcove, her back to him, wings trembling against the living wall. "Syris," he said softly, stepping closer. "What's wrong?" She didn't turn, but her voice cracked, raw with emotion. "I can't do this." Tears glistened on her crimson cheeks as she faced him, her golden eyes shimmering with pain. "I saw you die, Ethan, every night since the vision changed. You save us, but you're gone, and She broke off, pressing a hand to her chest. "I can't lose you." His heart twisted. He closed the distance, gently taking her arms. "You won't lose me," he said, though the lie burned his throat. "We'll find another way." She shook her head, pulling him deeper into the alcove shadows. "There is another way," she whispered, her voice desperate. "We could leave, take a shuttle, find another star system. Let Veylara face its fate without us." Her hands found his, guiding one to her chest, where her heart raced beneath her warm skin. The contact sent a jolt through him, her pulse a fierce rhythm under his palm, and he felt the curve of her body shift closer, her breath hot against his cheek. Her wings curved around them, a fragile shield, and for a moment he wanted nothing more than to surrender, to run, to hold her, to live. "Syris," he murmured, his voice rough, "you know I can't. Those people down there, the girl in the ruins, billions like her, they don't deserve to die." Her eyes searched his, tears falling freely now. "And you do." He had no answer, only pulled her close, her warmth anchoring him as the star's light flickered through the wall. They stood there, hearts pounding, until duty called them back. But the choice lingered, a wound neither could heal. Later, in the sanctuary of the Heart Grove, Ethan stood before a gathered council of Veylara elders, Syris at his side. The air hummed with anticipation as Kale presented their findings. The Veylara amplifier was ready, but it required Ethan's full integration, his consciousness, his essence, everything. Zoran watched from the shadows, his silence more threatening than words. "I'll do it," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the fear coiling inside him. "But first, I have a request." He turned to Syris, taking her hand. "A bonding ceremony. If I'm giving everything for Veylara, I want something for us, something real." Syris's eyes widened, her wings trembling. Zoran began to object, but an elder, a female with ancient, silver-streaked wings, raised a hand. "Grant him this," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Let them have their moment." The The ceremony took place beneath the Heartgrove's central tree, its glowing branches casting a soft light over the gathered witnesses. Ethan and Syris stood face to face, a delicate cord of living vine held between them. The elder wound it around their wrists, its purple glow pulsing in time with their breaths. Syris spoke first, her voice a melody in the Veylara tongue, words Ethan didn't understand but felt in his bones, promises of eternity, of light beyond shadow. He swallowed, his throat tight. "I don't have fancy words," he said, his voice low but clear. "But I know this. You're the reason I'm here, Syris. Not the star, not the prophecy. You. Whatever happens, I'm yours." The cord dissolved into sparks, sinking into their skin, a warmth that bound them beyond flesh. Her wings unfolded, their silver tips shimmering, and she leaned forward, pressing her lips to his, a quiet vow sealed in the grove's embrace. Hours later, alone in a quiet chamber, Ethan activated a salvage comms array, its signal patched through to Earth by Kale's ingenuity. Static crackled, then cleared, and his sister's voice came through, faint but unmistakable. "Ethan? Oh my God, where are you?" "Mia," he said, his chest aching. "I'm okay, but I'm not coming home." He told her about Veylara, about Syris, how he'd found something worth fighting for, worth dying for. "Tell Mom I love her," he choked out. "And you. Keep looking at the stars, kid. I'll be one of them." The signal cut out, leaving silence. Syris stepped into the room, her wings soft against the wall. She didn't speak, just took his hand, and together they faced the dawn of Veylara's final day. The temple of Veylara's heart pulsed with ancient energy, its crystalline spires rising like frozen flames toward the troubled sky. Beneath it lay the transfer chamber, a vast, organic cavern carved from the planet's core, its walls threaded with glowing conduits that thrummed like a heartbeat. Ethan Cole stood at its center, his breath shallow, the weight of his choice pressing against his chest. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and sap, and the chamber's ceiling shimmered with patterns of light, reflecting the stars' chaotic dance above. Syris stood nearby, her crimson skin pale under the glow, her purple wings folded tightly as if to shield her from what was coming. Her golden eyes met his, and in them, Ethan saw everything: love, fear, a desperate hope that this wasn't the end. He wanted to reach for her, to hold her one last time, but the technicians swarming around him were already attaching sensors to his temples and chest, their cold precision a stark contrast to the warmth he craved. Kale approached, his face etched with guilt and resolve. "The process will take 6 minutes," he said, his voice low. "You'll be conscious until the final stage. The virion in you, it'll bridge the star's core, stabilize it." But he faltered, unable to finish. Ethan nodded, forcing a wry smile. "No one's done this before, right? Guess I'm the lucky first." Kale gripped his shoulder, a silent apology in his eyes. "You're saving us, Ethan. All of us." As Kale stepped back, Ethan turned to Syris. She crossed the distance in a heartbeat, her hands finding his, her fingers trembling against his calloused palms. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "There's still time." He lifted a hand to her cheek, brushing away a tear that glistened like a ruby against her crimson skin. "I do," he said softly. "For you, for them, for that kid in the ruins. I've seen what's at stake, Syris. I can't walk away." Her wings shuddered, and she pressed her forehead to his, her breath warm and unsteady. "Then I'll find you," she vowed, her voice fierce despite the tears. "Wherever you go, whatever you become, I'll find you." He kissed her, brief but deep, pouring everything he couldn't say into that fleeting touch. Then he stepped back, nodding to Kale. The chamber's conduits flared, their light shifting from violet to a burning orange, and Ethan walked toward the crystalline pod at the center, a translucent heart, pulsing in time with the star above. He climbed inside, the surface cool against his skin, and as the pod sealed around him, he kept his eyes on Syris, memorizing her face, her wings, the way she stood like a beacon in the chaos. The process began with a hum that vibrated through his bones. Light flooded the pod, a swirling dance of orange and purple that wrapped around him like a tide. Ethan closed his eyes, and the star's presence surged into his mind. Not a voice, but a feeling vast and wild, a song of fire and loss. The virion in his blood answered, igniting beneath his skin, and he felt his body begin to unravel. Not painfully, but like a thread pulled loose, scattering into sparks. His thoughts frayed, memories flashing like stars. Mia's laughter, the Nevada sun, Syris's touch, and the heart grove. Through it all, her voice reached him, soft as a lullaby, echoing in his mind. "I'm here, Ethan. I'm with you." He clung to it, to her, as the star's energy consumed him. The pod glowed brighter, its light spilling into the chamber, a radiant storm that drowned out everything else. Ethan's form dissolved into countless shimmering particles, each one pulsing with the virion's golden fire. They streamed upward through the conduits, merging with the star's core, and in that final moment, he thought only of her. Her crimson warmth, her purple wings, her promise to find him. Outside, Syris stood frozen, her hands pressed against the pod's outer wall. As Ethan's body faded, she screamed his name, pounding the crystal with fists that left no mark. "No," she cried, her wings sagging, their silver tips dragging against the floor like broken things. Tears streamed down her face, but she couldn't look away, not even as the light grew blinding, swallowing the last trace of him. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the ground, a sob tearing from her chest, until the chamber shook with a new rhythm, steady and strong. She lifted her head, eyes wide. Beyond the temple spires, the star pulsed, not with chaos, but with life. Its fiery surface calmed, the dark cracks sealing like wounds, and gentle waves of light rippled across its face, singing a song only she could hear. Syris staggered to her feet, her wings trembling as she pressed a hand to the wall. Feeling it, the star was alive, and somewhere within its boundless heart, Ethan lingered. The chamber fell silent, the technicians staring in awe. Cale approached, his voice hushed. "It worked. The star, it's stable." Syris didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the sky. She felt him, not as he was, but as something eternal, woven into the light. "You kept your promise," she whispered, a fragile smile breaking through her grief. Weeks passed, and Veylara bloomed anew. Forests of bioluminescent trees stretched toward the heavens, their leaves catching the stars' steady glow. Cities rose from ash, their crystalline spires humming with life. Children laughed in the streets, their wings fluttering as they chased pulses of light that danced like fireflies. The Veylara, once shadowed by fear, now walked with hope, their eyes turned upward to a star that no longer threatened to consume them. Syris stood atop a hill overlooking the capital, the necklace Ethan had given her, a simple silver chain from Earth, warm against her chest. She wore it always, a tether to the man who'd changed everything. The star shone above, its light softer now, laced with a melody she felt in her bones. Closing her eyes, she reached out with her mind, as she did every evening, searching for him. And there it was, a spark, faint but undeniable, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. It wasn't his voice, not his face, but it was him, a fragment of his essence woven into the star's song. She smiled, her wings lifting slightly, their silver tips catching the breeze. "He's still here," she murmured, her fingers tracing the necklace. Forever. Life on Veylara moved forward. The council rebuilt, guided by Syris's visions. Visions no longer of death, but of renewal. Cale led efforts to harness the star's energy, creating technology that honored Ethan's sacrifice. Pilgrims visited the temple, where a single crystal glowed with Virion's light, a monument to the human who'd given everything. Syris stood among them sometimes, silent, her heart both heavy and full. Far across the galaxy, a human ship drifted through the void, an exploration vessel, its crew scanning distant stars. A signal flickered on their sensors, faint but persistent, a pattern unlike any they'd known. The captain, a young woman with eyes like Ethan's, leaned closer to the console. "What is that?" she asked, her voice tinged with wonder. The technician frowned, adjusting the feed. "It's a voice, maybe, embedded in the star's radiation." The signal crackled, and for a moment a whisper broke through, a man's voice, warm and familiar, though none could place it. "Keep looking at the stars, kid." The crew exchanged glances, the captain's hand tightening on her chair. "Trace it," she said. "Find where it's coming from." On Veylara, Syris stood beneath the night sky, the star's light bathing her in warmth. She didn't know about the signal, about the humans who'd hear Ethan's echo across the void. But she felt him, as she always would, a quiet presence that promised love could endure beyond flesh, beyond time. And as her wings spread wide, catching the star's gentle glow, she whispered to the light, "Until I find you again."